Hello, welcome to the Sustain, Change and Grow podcast. Today, I am delighted to welcome Romain Svartzman. Romain is an economist, or even ecological economist, if I can say so. So, very welcome, Romain, and please start by introducing yourself.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. So I'm today a research fellow at Bocconi University, university based in Milan, in Italy. More specifically, in an institute called the Institute for European Policymaking there. And I'm also a research associate at UCL in the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. As you said, I would consider myself as an ecological economist. I think we'll have time to talk a bit more about what this is about, but I would say that very broadly, it's an approach that tries to understand how the economic system works as being part of the biosphere rather than treating environmental issues just as something external to the economic discipline. But we'll probably get to dig further a little bit into what this means. Personally, I focus on monetary and financial issues related to the ecological transition. So this includes many topics, such as how to finance the transition, of course, but also what kind of fiscal, monetary, financial reforms are needed. Should we change the international financial architecture? Should we have greener central banks? Should we revisit our approach to debt to GDP ratio, issues like this? And I also try within all these questions to incorporate some geoeconomic or geopolitical questions, because I think it's essential if we talk about the low carbon transition to realize that this is happening not just in theory but in the real world, with a very broad movement such as U.S. policies, such as China becoming a leader in clean technologies and so on. So trying really to develop some interdisciplinary research between talking to economists, engineers, geopolitical experts, social and natural scientists, and so on. So I think that the background to that, and we'll probably also talk about that, but I think that the ecological transition is too important to be left only to economists, that we need to have an interdisciplinary dialogue. And perhaps to finish this introduction, before joining Bocconi University just a few months ago, actually, I had been working for 5 years at the French Central Bank, the Banque de France, where I was working on similar topics. And before that, I had completed my PhD at McGill University in Canada. I started my PhD quite late for relative to, I would say, most PhD students, because before starting my PhD, I had worked for 8 years in green finance, first for a private investment firm in venture capital, and then for the World Bank group, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector branch of the World Bank. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
You said that the ecological transition is a too important issue to leave just to the economist. Should we consider it as an economic problem?
It's is it an economic problem? I would say that yes and no. That there is a tendency of many economists or in the economic discipline to have sometimes a not very nuanced view of things. For instance, the economics of climate change, there have been many proposals in the past where economists wanted to, to tell us what was the optimal degree of climate change, of global warming, for instance, which is like in that case, we could say it's not at all for economists to think about that. This is a political problem, a scientific problem, and it shouldn't be economists telling us, oh yeah, you should accept warming up to this point, but not less, not more, and so on. However, insofar as the transition involves a complete transformation of our social, cultural, geopolitical, economic structure, it is, I think, a problem for economists, because it will have multiple implications for global capital, for global financial flows, for inflation, perhaps, whether it leads to inflationary or deflationary trends. It can be a problem for employment or an opportunity, but it is definitely a challenge because we will need new jobs in new places. It is also, of course, a big issue for fiscal sustainability, with some countries that may win from the transition, others that may lose from the transition. From the perspective, if you're like just an exporter of oil, obviously, or fossil fuels, obviously, you could you could see why the transition could be a problem. Whereas if you're a leader in clean technology products, you could win from it. So all these issues are deeply related to economic issues, of course. So I think that it is an economic issue, but we should be careful about not letting economists decide about how to think about it. So it's rather like economists should try to understand what are the political decisions, how to help this transition happen, but not tell us necessarily what should be done exactly. Like what kind of policy ambition we should have. I think this is not up to economists to decide.
Economics is the science of allocation of limited resources. Planet, each country has limited resources, and so we need economists to solve this issue. I believe, well, at least at this stage, that economic theories, they shape the world we live in and also shape how we see the world. Would you agree with this view?
It's I think an extremely complex question, and part of it relates even to what you just said. For instance, you about the definition you provide about economics, right? About the allocation of scarce resources among competing ends, which is a definition we often have. Some people would question even this definition, right? So, for instance, if you take Karl Polanyi, who's we could say a socioeconomist from the mid 20th century, someone I really like, who wrote a book called the Great Transition. He has a definition of like a substantive definition of economics, which has more to do with economics being the study of how society meets its material needs, basically by organizing itself and by interacting with its environment. So we could say that, like, just by taking this definition, we suddenly have a much more political view of economics. That's something than the one you provided, which is, I think, immediately take us more to like what is the optimal allocation of resources. Whereas you could have a different approach saying what are our needs, how do we allocate them, how do we want to allocate them, and so on. And so I would say that this is a very difficult question.
That was a bit purposeful. It related the way you said, like, the economist shouldn't dictate the political decisions. And so it sounded for me more like, well, some sort of accountants. So some technicians who will do what the political will, or the people decide. And so they will do, let's say, some mathematical accounting tricks and will find an optimal allocation. So it was a bit provocative in this direction.
And you got me. How do economic theory shape the world? What is the role? I started just showing why, like, it's an open question depending on how you see it. However, if you take what we could call the dominant approach in economics or the mainstream economics approach, although in practice it can cover quite a broad field, but if we leave aside a little bit this more critical perspective, basically, I think that's there are two extremes. One would be the position that not the one you defend, but the one you just explained about the economist like really believing that all she or he does is really scientifically describe the world we live in while providing solutions for more efficient economic decision making and so on. You could have another extreme saying economists are just and some people really say that, but which is I think also to some extent true, but perhaps we're saying that economists would just be some sort of the facade or the moral justifiers of things that are completely wrong in the world. We have crazy inequality, widespread environmental crisis. We'll probably talk about that and many other problems that economists are somehow defending or justifying the status quo. And I think that in both cases, both approaches are somehow a bit wrong. One example of this is that many people say, "Oh, economists they believe in Homo economicus." So basically, this theoretical economic agents that is perfectly informed, perfectly rational in a world of perfect competition and so on. And in practice, when we accuse economists of being like this, I think it's a bit a straw man argument because 90% of the economists I know and work with or talk to, they actually dedicate much of their work precisely to imperfect competition, asymmetry of information, different forms of externality, and so on. Same if you say all economists favor free trade. Well, it's this is something we could say, oh, they just want to to promote free trade. not exactly. You have many economists. I'm thinking here of Nobel Prize Krugman showing you, like, for instance, why, when trade barriers can be good, necessary, and so on. But if I try to say, okay, despite all these nuances and so on, how do economists contribute to shaping the world or reality? And I think that there are two axioms or two like statements that are considered to be like somehow always true. Two axioms that most so-called mainstream economists, or that are really like around which mainstream economics revolve. And the first one is like this idea of like methodological individualism, and the second one is really about a market view of the world, or market-based view of the world. And I'll try to perhaps there are probably many other things that are problematic, but I would say that this probably shapes a lot of like the range of what we consider to be like desirable, possible, and so on. So the first axiom, like, it's even before an axiom, is some sort of like epistemological framework within which economists work, is really this methodological individualism. So basically, this idea that any social phenomenon you see is the outcome of individual actors, right? So that we don't think that it is about social classes, about culture, power relation. It's about like about individual decision making. And in fact, when you look at other social sciences, for sociology in the 19th century, it was like precisely fierce debates between, like, is it about, should we adopt an individualist worldview, a holistic worldview, and so on. So to some extent, economy seems, and here I think it's a big issue I have with that, they seem to be like a little bit left in the past in this debate, where they took sides for an individualist approach, and basically they are very uncomfortable to think about, like, about why social classes matter, why history matter, why you have different power structure, and so on. In the end, there will be this idea that everything is micro-funded, that everything comes from microeconomics, and from there goes to macroeconomics. And I think this is very very problematic. One idea of that, if you want to think about, like, how do we reduce poverty in a given country? One way would be to say, oh, we're going to, like, look at what are the right incentive, or perhaps what are the good institutions. There's something quite fashionable these days in economics about, like, randomized controlled trials, or RCT, and so on. But basically, all these approaches, which have some very interesting perspective, they bring a lot of methodological novelty and so on, but they run into the risk of completely leaving aside um, the big structure of this country that explain why poverty exists in the first place, which are, like, which would in this case require to think about history, politics, international relation, and so on. So I'm thinking here of a critical economist, for instance, Ha-Joon Chang, who wrote a famous book called Kicking Away the Ladder, where he argues, in my opinion, he demonstrates, but let's say that at the very least, he argues that developed economies used very interventionist policies to get rich before they started, like, imposing barriers, and even through violence, to prevent developing countries or poorer countries from implementing the same policies. In some cases, we also know from history that, like, even free trade, so-called free trade, was imposed through violence, right? We can think about the UK, the British Empire, rather, engaging in two wars with China in the 19th century, because China banned or didn't want to import opium from India, which was part of the British Empire.
More modern history, it's the international organization, the IMF and the World Bank, which imposed the free market concepts to the developing countries via the mechanism of aid. You need to repay debt, so you need to do liberal reforms, privatization, free markets, no barriers, etc.
Yeah, and exactly, and I think that, like, we cannot blame entirely economists for all this. It would be unfair. However, I think that what we really see is that this, like, this micro view, that, like, it comes from a view of grounding in what I was calling a methodological individualism, where, like, where everything I just said right now, like, would lead us to think, okay, how does a country get rich? Well, we need to think about the importance of history, of, like, of violence, of power relation across nations, of social classes within and across nations, and so on. And all those things, like, tends to be left aside precisely because there is this idea that, like, it is about optimization, that it is about good incentives and so on. So I think that this is something again where I wouldn't say economists are responsible for all this. They have shaped all of this because there are real world dynamics
Yeah.
that go way beyond what economists think. But they do somehow, or I would say their analytical framework does justify an approach that makes it harder to generate or to think about the structural change that we need. So I guess that's how I would try to frame it with this methodological individualism.
Let me contradict you a little bit.
Sure, pleasure.
This thinking of the free markets and the liberal market economies, it's one of the theories. They were different. So Keynes had a very different theory. There were others. And still, this theory prevailed. It prevailed in the United States. It was imposed across the world. It had a very tangible and significant results, well, consequences rather, on the United States and the world as well. In the world, it can be in terms of the poverty. In the United States, it's the huge inequality, right? So you have extremely rich, but you have a large population who are not rich. And it had also impact on the on the climate change, right? So we haven't got to this point yet. We can even trace to the people who had the certain perception, and they were probably strong enough, or maybe they were something else. There is some potentially political interest or the interest of certain class who were interested in having this, economic view, which would justify their actions.
Again, I'm trying. I do agree with this idea that economics can definitely serve and does definitely serve in many cases the interests of specific social classes. Again, I think my only hesitation is about not making statements that are too strong and perhaps too simplistic. I think it's fine to simplify, but I would just be afraid of saying, something that we can hear quite often, right? That economists simply serve the interests of the powerful. So I would say that again, it depends. It depends a little bit because you do have a lot of work, for instance, in economics about about rents, how rents can be a problem, and so on. So you could say that in that case, you're not necessarily benefiting the interest of the powerful if you're saying like we should precisely reduce or forbid specific rents made by specific actors. So we could always, and the reason I'm saying that is that otherwise, we can see sometimes, as I said before, some people saying, actually, there was a video recently of a French economist I really like, but saying something a bit too simplistic about how economists always favor free trade, and that led to a lot of backfiring. Saying, oh, hasn't this guy revised his international economics and international trade 101 because this is not what we say, and so on. So this is why also I'm trying to be a bit nuanced. This being said, it's true that this methodological individualism mixed up with this market view, I would tend to separate them a little bit, but it's true that they're closely connected. That it prevents us from approaching the problem from a structural perspective from the very beginning. This is why I was giving this example of when you go to if you're trying to reduce poverty in a specific country, do you look just at incentive or do you look at what is the structure? Now, when you have work on the structure, saying I account for the history, for whether there was colonization, whether there were wars, whether what are the social structure within the country, and so on. Once you have done that, by no means I mean that there should be no markets or that market is bad and so on. This is really not what I mean. But it's more about really making sure that we don't consider that market is either the natural way to go or the the one thing that would work well. And from there, usually economists would bring governments, or mainstream economists would bring the government as a second step, saying, for instance, markets, the market sphere can generate externalities such as asymmetry of information, environmental degradation, and so on. And then, okay, maybe it's necessary to have the government. Whereas in practice, if you study a little bit of history, anthropology, you know that there have never been markets that exist out of nowhere, right? It's before you have a market, you have people producing. Why do they produce? How do they produce? Do they use slave? How much of this wealth do they redistribute? So somehow like this myth of that everyone has studied economics either for just one semester or for like a whole PhD, and like we all started, I think, from like this supply and demand curve that is a completely theoretical world where you have like like two people, you don't know where they come from, and you're like, one has apples and he would like bananas, and the other has banana, he would like apples, and like, oh great, they can have an exchange. And in the real world, it's like it is crazy to think that this is a useful simplification, because like by the before you have an exchange of a banana versus an apple, which is also like we also know that barter has never been really a thing in any society, but basically once you have like this kind of exchanges, because you already have a society there with people who specialize in different things, because you have governments, because you have or different structure. It can be religious, so it can be more like a sovereign state, an emperor, it doesn't matter. But market doesn't happen, it doesn't take place out of nowhere. And I think this is this was my point. But it's really not to neglect that that markets have contributed to decrease poverty, but really to understand much more specifically in which cases, why, one way, when did it work, did it work for everyone, and so on. So this is more my approach.
But I think the problem is really not the markets as a structure. The problem is everything that comes with it, like what we would call maybe capitalism and all the institutional structures. It's the same as you can say you have the government, which is authoritative, and then you say like the governments are bad. It's not the governments, it's the same, it's not the markets, it's the structure which underlines how these markets and how these governments would work. And this, I think, this is actually related to the economic theory, because the economic theory is everywhere. The central bank decide on their decisions based on the models from the mainstream economic theory. You go to the street, you ask any person, and everybody will say that economic growth is essential. We can't live without the economic growth, and we need the growth of the GDP. But even the GDP is an economic concept which was born about 90 years ago. And so, what GDP defines as monetary value, you plant the trees, you cut the trees, that contributes to the GDP. That's again a social economic construct, but it defines how we will look at the world, and it will define what matters, what is valued, and what is not. For example, what is valued is a certain activity and actually certain monetary activity, something that you can measure in money. So, for example, if you whatever help your friends, your family, this is not counted. You do homework, this is not counted. On the other hand, you cutting trees is just as valuable as planting trees because it has no sign. And this is again, this is an economic construct, but it defines the life we live.
Yeah, I think there's a question here, which is an important question, economics in general, the one of causality, but here taking more the political level, where it's difficult to say whether these things exist because of economists, like whether it's like our construction of GDP that creates a certain reality, or whether they're existing social relation, existing power structures and so on that like that run the real world and that try to be explained. And perhaps the economists in that case, we could see it more as I was saying at the very beginning, would become more the justifier of a social order. It's probably it probably works in two directions, I would say. Like the image I have to describe it is probably like a series of loops where like you have a certain social reality um, generating an impact on ideas trying to explain this reality, and these ideas in turn can come to shape reality. But I would say that that I would just be a bit careful about not saying it all has to do with economic theory, because I think it has to do with real world social relation that go beyond economic about ideas in general and about economic ideas in particular. So it's part of the process, but I wouldn't put all the blame on economists, no matter how problematic I think that their view is.
But okay, actually, this is interesting because I think it can help to think about how do you solve the issue. Let's take just the example of the GDP. If you replace GDP by another maybe set of indicators focused on the let's say human, but not only human, the planet well-being, right? So let's take it large. And so then the governments, instead of focusing on the increase in the GDP, they will be focusing on improving the well-being of all the live and non-live beings on the planet. For you, if you say that the economics is just, let's say, a servant for the political and social class structures, then changing the GDP by this set of indicators is not going to solve the problem. I think it will.
Yeah, I think we disagree then on that point. But I have to say, given that I work a lot as an ecological economist on issues related precisely to like post growth, degrowth, and so on. Not meaning that I have a huge conviction, because there's so much uncertainty about like where what we should do. But this is a topic I've been thinking a lot. I have to say that I find myself on this specific topic of like beyond GDP indicators, like thinking about wealth in a different wealth and production in a different manner. I find myself in disagreement with many colleagues on that front, and it's true that personally I think that I don't want to say we shouldn't spend too much time on indicators, on alternative indicators, but I would say that the potential for change of these indicators is very limited, and the reason I am thinking that way is perhaps because precisely I think that like that the history of ideas is important, but it's also the reflection of things happening in the real world, of real social relation. I would say that in the case of the system we live in, if I go for like an extreme summarized version of like what capitalism is, you could say like it's a system based on, among others, the commodification of labor. And on the constant search for profits and capital accumulation related to these profits. If that's the case, the real problem is that if we have a very nice system that doesn't make GDP grow more, there's a tremendous problem, which is that value added becomes limited, that GDP becomes limited, and in a system that is gear that is plugged toward the constant search for profits, what could happen there? I guess that like capital owners, the capitalists in a political economy perspective, would try to generate profit perhaps by increasing their rents. They could say, okay, let's increase like real estate, let's invest in financial markets and so on. So it's a very concrete problem if you don't have growth. So, and I think this is what matters to me. Whereas if you say there's growth along with like an increase in social indicators, like if we can have some sort of green and inclusive growth, I'm very skeptical toward that. But if we had that, it would be less problematic for the system we live in. And I think it's a very concrete problem, and this is why I think that just by looking at alternative indicators, I really got it why we want to do that, and I think it's important, but we really don't solve the problem. I really don't believe, I think in the story that will be like, oh, if only we looked at the right indicators, things would work better, because it wouldn't address the specific structure of the system we live in. And I think this is why I pay a lot of attention, or I place a lot of emphasis on like what is the structure, how does it work, and so on.
Yeah, I think maybe where we disagree is in the word just, because for me, it's not just the indicator that will solve the problem. It's rather it will have to drive all other changes, because you will have to reconsider the relationships that have been built. So, and I think at some point we probably agree with you that actually, if now you focus on the well-being, you can't preserve all the same relationships that you have in the growth economy. Indeed, just one indicator is not going to change anything. But for me, it's rather that because we will change the focus of our attention, so we will have to reconsider what matters in the society and how the society works and all the relationships that we have.
hmm Yeah, I find your point very interesting because maybe what I was saying before is a little bit influenced, but by what I've been seeing from the work, at least until a few years ago, because I haven't been following up with the very latest development in these, like alternative indicators. But until I could say only until 4 to 5 years ago, I would say that people who were working on that had little interest out of my exchange with them, the experience I had with them. The people working on that had little interest precisely in using this focus or this lens of, like saying, oh, we need alternative indicators, to use that as a way of saying how achieving these indicators, these other indicators, could lead us to ask for specific socioeconomic, cultural, political power change. And I couldn't see this link, which is precisely why I've always been like a bit critical, I would say, of thinking like that just using a different lens is enough. But the way in which you say this, like, like using a different lens, changing the focus, is a way of questioning certain things. I would say that I recognize myself much more in this kind of approach.
Let's move to the next question. So, what is the role of the nature in the current economic paradigm?
Yeah. So going back perhaps to what we were discussing before, right? This view of economics as, like of this mainstream view of economics as being, like grounded in methodological individualism, with this market view of the world, where, like the 101 is like you have exchange on the market, you don't know why, and so on. So basically, nature is absent from there. Like when we discussed all these things a few minutes ago, we haven't mentioned at all nature. So basically, nature appears as an afterthought in mainstream economics. It appears usually through environmental issue. So basically, nature degradation. It could be the exhaustion of a natural resource. It could be climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. And it is considered in all mainstream economics textbooks as an externality, as a negative externality in the case of nature degradation. So basically, this idea of negative externality is that, you have negative consequences of a transaction that affect like third parties. So if you and I, for instance, have a transaction, we exchange an agricultural good, but by exchanging it, actually the production of this good polluted someone listening to us. The externality is like the pollution caused to the third party to the exchange we had. So basically, nature, what that means, that nature is external to economic reality. It comes potentially if environmental exhaustion, environmental degradation generates a cost. This is where it comes in. And as a result of this view, which I think is very problematic, I'll try to explain why perhaps a bit later. But basically, the response is precisely to re-internalize this externality. So to re-internalize the cost generated by the exchange, so as to find an optimum. We go back to the definition of economists as being like the optimal allocation of resources among competing ends. So basically, the cost for the third party should be reduced up to the optimal level where it does not impede too much our exchange. So, for instance, applied to climate change, we have a Nobel Prize in economics, or some people would say it's not a real Nobel Prize and so on, but I would just say Nobel Prize for simplicity. So, William Nordhaus, who estimated that the optimal level of climate change is 3.5, of global warming is 3.5 degrees Celsius, meaning, in his view, that aiming to mitigate climate change more than that would decrease welfare too much. Whereas if we leave climate change being higher than 3.5, global warming being higher than 3.5 degrees Celsius, in that case, the cost of climate change would decrease welfare too much. So this is really about where is the optimum, what is the optimal pollution. It's really what how mainstream economics sees nature. Um, of course, I think this is extremely problematic for many reasons. One of them is a bit more method. One of them is quite methodological. So, for instance, I gave this extreme example of William Nordhaus, who nevertheless got the Nobel Prize. But like this idea that like the optimal level of increase in global mean temperature would be 3.5 degrees is absolutely nuts when you look at what scientists are telling us, that like this could be a level where we would have extreme, more severe and more frequent events happening, with hundreds of millions of people living, no longer being able to live in a certain place, a lot of wildlife going extinct and so on. So it's a bit crazy that someone comes up saying this is the right approach. But you could also have other approaches of economy saying, oh, no, I'm not going to say what the right level of global warming is, but I'm just going to find the most optimal solution if we want, say, to remain within 2 degrees Celsius. But it's still based on this idea that like what we need to do is to put a price. What is the right price for that? So what is the right price on carbon so that all agents can internalize like this climate externality? And I think this is still a huge problem because precisely we're still grounded in what I was describing before, right? That it is a micro-funded approach of, like one thing is like you and I polluting the land of someone of our neighbor. Another thing is like something completely global and systemic as climate change, and saying we're going to use the same approach is crazy. In the case of climate change, we need to revisit the whole system. What are technologies? How do we live? How do we transport ourselves? How do we heat ourselves? How do we eat? And so on. And like, what are the policy we want to have? What technologies? Do we need sufficiency policies to decrease demand a little bit? Do we need do we need industrial policy? What is the international financial system the right one? So basically, these are the real questions that become completely forgotten by the mainstream approach to nature.
I imagine that the pricing of the carbon is not going to solve this issue.
In my mind, I mean, my view, clearly not. There's even a recent report by a group of scholars based in the UK. The report or the initiative, it's EEIST. I can't remember exact acronym, so I'm not going to develop it. But they have an excellent report. It's called something like 10 policy lessons for low carbon transition, something like this, where they clearly show that the successes we had so far are very little related to carbon pricing and much more to actual policy. So, for instance, really research and development in a specific technologies, or even like urban planning in a specific city, and it's like a much more concrete thing than carbon pricing that makes things happen. The problem with carbon pricing, I think, is that it comes really, like it could work at the micro level. Again, for the example where where it's a problem between you, I, and the third party, and we can definitely solve that, like with a compensation or with a price that solves the situation. But there's a problem of scale. We cannot solve like a global issue such as climate change with that. We also realize that like if we broaden the scope a little bit, we talk about biodiversity loss, then we have a multiplicity of indicators. What is like, are we gonna like put a price on the frog, a price on the tree, a price on like genetic diversity? Like like how are we gonna put prices on all of these things, right? And it goes back to the question of thinking about the system as a whole. We cannot escape it. Perhaps one thing to say though is that I'm not against prices, but I think that the way in which we like one perhaps simplified example to think about that is if you think about the fact that today in many countries we have suburban lifestyle, right? That's where many people live in suburbs, where they drive to the suburb and so on. And this is not because of prices. This is because in the past there were like the willingness to develop the automobile industry. There was the culture of individual cars and so on. So if you just say we're going to solve all of this with a price on carbon, do we believe that there will magically be like new technology, new infrastructure, and so on? Or do we believe that what will happen is the movement such as the yellow vest in France, where people will feel that as being deeply unjust and unfair? However, if we start by saying we need to revert some of these suburban lifestyle consequences, so we need to develop more infrastructure, or it could be trains, it could be electric vehicles. We need to invest in research and development, facilitating, creating subsidies to invest in these technologies and so on, to develop the infrastructure that's related to that. And once the infrastructure is in place, the technological alternative in place, then you could use a price to incentivize people to make different choices. But you cannot assume that the price will create a new world. It's like once you have it, prices can be a very powerful instrument. But I think there's a huge confusion um, between like whether prices can generate change or whether they can, once the alternative is there, whether they can be used. And I believe they can be used in the second instance only. So I would say carbon price is definitely part of the mix, but it is, I find it a bit insane that like to think that it is the first best solution, as many mainstream economists would say.
I think what is also probably missing is that I don't know if it's the understanding or if it's purposeful omission, but the markets, how good they can be, they are useful and relevant only in certain areas, and they cannot solve such a complex issue as the climate change or the biodiversity loss by themselves, because the whole mechanism works through the search of the profits. And in the biodiversity, well, the nature is not going to pay you unless we put a price on it. But again, in a way, we're probably some sort of commodifying the nature in this case, and we don't know how it will turn against us in the future. Like if we put a price on the nature, because the markets are clever, they can find a way how to make money even out of this, and the nature will be in even in a worse state. I think, at least what I understand what you're saying, is that in a sense we should go to more local level and to rethink the like socioeconomic tissue, how things work at a very local specific level. And I think what is important also, though this word is usually not liked, but some sort of, well, if not planification, but at least certain, let's say, political powers saying what is direction of travel, so that all of us at each different individual levels go in the same direction.
Yes, I think that that what you said about planification or planning, depending on which word we want to use, because as you said, sometimes as soon as you use certain words such as planification, now things are starting to change. But until a few years ago, people would believe that we're talking about getting rid of the market, like a purely socialist economy and so on, which is but I really like the way which you put it, like clearly showing the direction of travel. I think this is fundamental. And if you look today at what is happening, I think that the two main direction of travel that we're seeing with regard to low carbon transition, not meaning that I think they're the right ones, but the two ones we're seeing, one is China, where there was a policy that has been developed for like decades now, and clearly this is what explains why China today is the leader in many low carbon technologies, and also why they control so much of the entire supply chain of these technologies. So, for instance, the extraction and or processing of the critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and so on that is needed for this low tech. China has been invested in securing the supply chain and also capturing like the technology needed to transform them, embed them in solar panels, in electric batteries, and so on. So China has been thinking about that as a very long-term project. Now you have another country also doing, I would say, a much lighter, but still some form of planning or sending a clear direction. Rather, I should say in this case, it's the U.S. with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very like the name really doesn't reflect much of what's there, but clearly it is a huge fiscal and to some extent industrial, although only to some extent industrial policy, where like there is a decision, there is an acceptation that in order to compete with China or to let China catch up the U.S. in the case of the U.S. That like something very big is also needed, and we were seeing that this is changing the pattern, some of the pattern of like new investments. We've seen some firms, for instance, really in the field of critical minerals in the EU, moving to the US because of the subsidies, saying this is the only way for us to be competitive with Chinese firms and so on. So we really need these huge signals, which are not easy. I'm not saying that all we need is to have a good industrial and fiscal policy, because again, it goes back to the political economy, to the power structure we were mentioning before. For instance, this is going to increase debt. So what do we do out of it? Do we want to tax the rich more? Do we want to accept to live with higher level of debt? If we live with higher level of debt, do we want central banks to somehow like keep interest rate a bit low low for governments to raise funding. If we do so, some people would say we're losing central bank independence. Financial markets may get a bit afraid of that. So all of these things have consequences. Nothing will be simple, but I would say at least we would be talking about the real thing that really matter, much less than like a theoretical price on carbon. So this is for me really where the direction of travel should be. Um, as you may see, perhaps you had two questions, but you may see from this response, I'm thinking a bit more global than local. In my case, I do think that local dimension is fundamental, but perhaps more the democratic way of ensuring that decisions can be implemented at the local level, where people know their like their local community and territories better and so on. But I think that we need to start from the global, and that we need to have a structural or a systemic way of addressing these issues.
It's interesting because from what I see, many people, when feeling eco anxiety and thinking about the climate change, think very often they actually go back to the local level, the communities. And they say, okay, let's, fix it already here at our local level. How we use water, how we pollute, how we travel, how we heat, what relationship we build with each other. Like, for example, this donut economics, invented and promoted by Kate Roffers. It's also a little bit about this. So, how can we create the system which works for the people and for the planet, but each individual level, a company, a city, municipality. That's the tendency I see, and I think it's important because many things actually they should get back to the local level, because at some point I think we become too globalized and we kind of ignored what is just next to us, including the probably even the people. In the search for efficiency at work, everywhere, we also somewhat commodified our own life, and so people are kind of getting back to the basics. But at the same time, I agree with you that the problem is so global, like so planetary, that it has to be solved also at the global level.
I agree that we can see a strong trend toward local initiative and so on, and I think that they can be very important for many reasons. First, it's fundamental that as part of the transition, like that people have a sense that they have agency somehow, that they have the ability to be part of that, to influence this transition, so on. So I would be concerned about something completely imposed from a top-down perspective and so on. There's also what I briefly mentioned before, that there's a better, more in-depth knowledge of your territory, of your institutions, of your community, and so on. So it's important to have at the very least, like a subsidiarity approach, for instance, as in the case of the EU, where the principle of subsidiarity, like is about like making sure that the decision is taken at the most local level possible. In each case, it's important. And I would say that perhaps there can even be things that can feed back into the global, that there are things we could learn from specific experiences conducted at the local level. So, for instance, there's this initiative in France called Territoire contre le chômage de longue durée, something like this. So basically, it's like territories that try to implement, to show that like it is perfectly possible to hire people who have been unemployed for a long term. And basically, like they created like a lot of non-profit or for profit sometimes activities, but like their idea is really to show that like that there are ways of employing people who have been unemployed for a long time, that the market like does not accept, and so on, that we can think of very bright ideas, and you need to be working on the local scale to do that. So I really believe that these things matter. This being said, I think that some of the issues I have with something that is a bit too local. One is there is a form of renouncements to there's a risk of renouncements um, to something that I also find very beautiful, which is this connection that we have among humans. That these interactions, I want to live in a largely globalized world where I can interact with many people, many cultures, and so on. So like from a very ethical perspective, I would be a bit concerned about something very local. Then, from a very practical perspective, I think that sometimes we underestimate how global the economy has always been, not only become, but almost always been. Even if you look at, like agriculture in the early 20th century, we have, like, or in 19th century, um, we had a lot of inputs coming from other parts of the world and so on. So we have always needed, when whatever we eat, no matter how we move, no matter how we heat our homes and so on, we should be careful about not falling into a trap where, like, in our, even if we go for like public transportation with clean vehicles, that we eat more vegetarian than that we have like some local source of electricities. We still need concrete, we still need infrastructure, we still need the elements for the battery of the vehicles. We still need, like, there's some region where there is no much agricultural output, so there will need to be exchanged with other regions. So I think there's sometimes a little bit of a an underestimation of how global the economy is by definition. So this is something that matters a little bit to me. And then there's also sometimes, like, if you look, for instance, about food, you look at, you take, I don't know, people eating meat and saying, oh, but this is local meat. It's fine. I'm sure it matters that it is local meat and so on. But if your concern is about CO2 emissions, the transportation of these meats is a very small percentage of like of the whole carbon footprint of the meat you're eating. Like the problem, the very basic problem is about cattle and the emissions related to cattle. So sometimes there can be also like a false sense of priority. So this is why I'm a bit I have a lot of sympathy for many local initiatives, but I'm a bit skeptical when it replaces or when it denies the importance of thinking more global. And I know, like, sometimes saying thinking global, acting local, and so on, but in practice, what does it mean? So I would say we also need to act globally, not only think globally.
We need funding for the transition, but maybe very often it's not really the funding, and especially not what the global investors which are somewhere over there, which are thinking of the great solutions to our local problems and how the funding should arrive. So it's not really a matter of the extra funding, but rather rethinking certain processes that were in place that came due to unawareness, but now when people become more aware of the issues, biodiversity loss, climate change, etc., they're rethinking, and this could be done without really extra financial resources. And I think that's actually a rather positive trend.
To which extent it's relative? I guess there is probably a trade-off between saying how much I can change the global system versus, like, how much I can, without waiting for global change, at least do at my level, at my scale, and so on. So I do understand this approach, but I think that in the end, if we think about the energy system, the mobility transportation system, about the food system, and so on, that there's only so much, and sometimes it's very little what you can do without transforming the system, unfortunately. But I think it's also the reality that if we want to have, like, what is the energy matrix we want for France, the EU, for the world, and so on. And these are things that cannot be just the aggregation of little things happening here and there. That at some point, we need probably some big sources of energy. But even if we have many small sources of energy, we need an electricity grid so that, like, there can be exchange of energy and so on. So and same for the food system and so on. So I would say that there's a limitation, I would say, to what can be done there. And then there's a question also of it's true that like what that it will not be like, like a big pension fund that is going to solve all this problem for you and me and us. But then there's still a question of how much does it cost to do that. So the real question indeed is about what do we want to do, how do we want to do it, how do we want to transform, like, what kind of job do we need to do that, what kind of lifestyles are compatible with what we want to do, and so on. But once you define that, you also need to be able to, like, to account for how much it's going to cost and how they want to fund it. And there are many ways of funding it. So I don't believe in the approach saying, oh, yeah, there's a problem with funding, we don't have the money, and so on. But then there's this question that is by definition, at the very least, national, if not global, but about how much do we tax people? Or do we want to fund that through debt? Or do we want to have precisely like a global industrial policy or a national industrial policy so that we can access this material, these technologies, and so on? And I think that the local level on its own cannot respond to this question. So we still need this policy mix, this industrial policy kind of question, so on. And in my mind, it doesn't mean that it denies individual agency or that it denies the importance of local communities or of local initiatives.
Yeah, but I think here we agree it's not one or the other. For me, I believe we need both.
I agree. I agree. Maybe I have more of an emphasis on the importance of the global, but we definitely need both.
How can we consider the nature within the economic system to make its justice?
Yeah, it's not something that where I feel very comfortable talking about precisely. I know that like there are many scholars that I really like. You mentioned Kate Raworth before, and there are many people thinking about like a different system and so on. For me, it's a bit difficult as a both as an individual and as a researcher, like to just like say, oh, this is a better system because we will need to rethink of everything. This being said, I would say that for me, what I find quite important is can we build or can we leave room for an alliance of different progressive forces? And when I talk about progressive forces, where what I see is that there is a tension, a big tension between alternative systems that would somehow correspond to a better or a more regulated version of capitalism versus a better system of people who talk about something that is completely out of reach today, which is something that's probably post-capitalist, right? And and for me, it's more about how do we make room for this in public debate, in the academic debates, and so on. In the way I see it, unfortunately, I'm not going to respond to like what is the system and so on. But what I try to do, for instance, as a scholar, is to join or to link up different field or school of thoughts that, in my opinion, enable us to bring some of these different views. So, for instance, I mentioned that like I come from this field of ecological economics, which basically really assesses the economic system as being embedded in the biosphere. So basically, the environment is not something external out there, but we're trying to understand how every time we produce, we redistribute, we exchange, and so on, how this comes up with specific material extraction, with specific pollution, like so. Basically, we're embedded in the biosphere.
How does it include it? So you have as inputs the physical limits, right? Just how much we have oil or the minerals, and how much the CO2 is produced. How different it is from the mainstream. That in the mainstream, essentially, you don't have anything. But capital and labor, that's the only two production factors that you have.
Yeah. So in ecological economics, it's really exactly the starting point is not to say there is only capital and labor, and then we will see if we add natural capital and so on. But it's really to say we are parts of the biosphere. So basically, whatever we do, whatever activity we undertake, requires to extract material and to use energy and to dissipate this energy because of the laws of thermodynamics. But like we will always basically being dissipating energy and generating basically pollution. So it doesn't mean that like every economic activity is bad, but it's really a different analytical framework. From there, what it means, it can mean very, very different things. But I think it's the importance of what we were discussing before about how does your analytical framework change things. So some ecological economists would say, based on that, they will want to work on like this question of like we need to be valuing things differently. We need to have like what you discussed before, all these alternative indicators to GDP and so on, because what matters is not only your monetarized wealth, but also the health of ecosystem, the social health, and so on. Others will work on saying, like, given that everything we undertake is material at its core, it means that there are limits to growth. Therefore, how do we live? Where are these limits to growth? And this is like a very difficult topic because it's not set in stone. But then, like, how do we live within these limits to growth? So Kate Raworth, that you mentioned before, with this concept of donut economics, she completely considered herself as being an ecological economy. So these are examples of how like by thinking with a different analytical framework, it doesn't mean that you have one solution, but it can lead you toward this kind of discussion, this kind of academic work, rather than something that is what is the right price, I would say.
How do you take into account the biodiversity in these models? I don't see it practically.
Yeah, which is something that can be the criticism that sometimes is also made to ecological economists, that they have like some perhaps a much more realistic or scientifically grounded analytical framework, but that it doesn't necessarily answer what should be done. In the case of biodiversity, for instance, this is the topic that I'm working on. One thing I'm doing today is to say how, like, what are the scenarios out there that need to take place in order to protect biodiversity. One thing I'm doing, for instance, is looking at the different targets of the global biodiversity framework. So this is a framework that's a result of the Montreal Kunming COP16 on biodiversity, which took place at the end of 2022, where all the countries in the world signed this agreement. Almost all the countries, sorry, in the world signed this agreement aimed at protecting, at reversing biodiversity loss. And there are many targets. So one of the targets is about protecting 30% of land and seas in the world. Another one is about reducing pesticides. Another one is about reducing the use of plastic. Another one is to increase financial resources for developing countries, and so on. There are many targets. So what I'm trying to do in the first place is say, what do these targets mean economically? For instance, if you want to reduce pesticides, you could have a scenario saying, instead of saying what is the right price to reduce the pesticide, it's rather to say, okay, do we believe that if we reduce pesticide, we will just have a technological substitute? In that case, how much does it cost? Who produces it? And so on. Do we rather believe that it will be a huge impact for agricultural productivity, agricultural output? Sorry. So in that case, again, what are the economic consequences of all this, and so on? Another idea would be to say, okay, could we work on a scenario where all other things being equal, reducing pesticides could reduce agricultural output. However, if we mix that up with a transformation of our agri-food system in the way we produce, but also the way in which we consume, how much meat we eat in particular, in that case, we can mitigate some of the negative impacts of this. So basically, the first thing is about the importance of opening up to like what are the scenarios out there, and that was something I wanted to say in the previous question, that for me, ecological economics alone is not enough, that we need to work with different fields. And for me, for instance, I work a lot with post-Keynesian economics because I think they have a more realistic view of the monetary and financial system. I work with some political economy because they really bring this question of power, social conflict, and so on. But also we need to work perhaps with other social sciences, for instance, anthropology. Like an anthropologist or sociologist is probably better placed to understand why and how people may change their eating habits than than an economist, for instance. So it's basically, once we put these things together, we have at least storylines that are essential and that are both more realistic and more complex than oh, let's find the right price of biodiversity, which is really not what this is about. We know what are the big decisions we need to make to protect biodiversity, and then it's like, okay, how are they going to happen, in which context, and so on. And then the big questions: how do we understand the economic impacts of that? How do we work on that? Are we fine with using the mainstream economic models, or do we also need alternative economic models? This is a different. I don't know if I'll have time to get into that, but this is sort of a different question. But the main point here I want to make is that ecological economics, for me, doesn't give you the response to how do we work on this, but it provides for the analytical framework from which you can work very differently on certain topics. So here I was providing this example of the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework, from which, like for now, with some colleagues, with some co-authors, we're trying to assess if we want to protect 30% of land globally. Can we know more or less where this land is? Can we see if this land is currently used to produce specific agricultural outputs that are used in the global economy, how important and how substitutable are they in global value chains. And we're trying to look at these things which don't provide the ultimate response to everything, but I think are quite applied and empirical to better understand whether and how biodiversity protection could generate tensions or not with the current economic system. So this is just one example of that, where how from a broad idea, a broad analytical framework, you can get to very specific or concrete work.
It's a very different framework how we make decisions.
It is, or at least about how we think about the problem as economists, because in the more mainstream approach, what you have is that you have the solution is already given to some extent. Given that environmental issues are by definition externality, the whole framework is already set. There's nothing else you can do. It is an externality by definition. Whereas here, to some extent, each problem requires you to say, okay, what is this problem? Is it a problem that is just precisely when we're talking about local global? Is it a local problem? Is it more global? Is it about how we eat, how we produce? So you have your first responsibility is to identify the nature of the problem, which I think is essential if we want to live in a more like realistic, grounded world as economists. And then once you have identified the problem, comes the question about what is the right methodology to understand this problem. And here too, ecological economics doesn't give you the answer in itself, which is sometimes even a problem in the sense that many ecological economists end up using sometimes methodologies that are not really, I think, adequate for the problem that they're trying to identify. But basically, once you understand the problem, you say, what is the methodology? It could be the model that you are thinking of using in the first place, but there's no reason why it would be, because if your problem is that how is this specific input that I no longer have for the global economy, could it disrupt value chains in the short term? If that is your question, the last thing you would want to do is to use a big general equilibrium framework that is used in mainstream economics, which by definition is not set for this purpose. You may go for something much more simple. You may use input output table databases that just show you how different sectors and regions or countries in the world are connected to each other. And so you're like, okay, if I have a shock there, it can travel here and there and there, and you can better understand in an almost qualitative manner, like this problem. If instead of that, your point of departure is, okay, land, if we want to protect lands, it's going to be a problem because there will be less lands available for industrial purposes. Maybe the model you need to have is completely different. It could be like there are some stock flow consistent models in the post-colonial literature that may be more adapted to to look at some of these issues. So basically, the point here is that the model is not a given there. And usually the model already contains its own diagnosis of the problem. And here my approach at least is really to start from a fair diagnosis that sometimes lead me like to work with like people in very different fields, and from there to say, okay, from an economic perspective, how do we think about that? So this is I would say the approach I have, and this is why I was saying that ecological economics, I think it's a very valuable point of departure, but on its own, it doesn't tell you much about how you have to work on each problem, and this is why I think it's fundamental to merge this discipline or this approach with other discipline, which in my case are post-Keynesian economics, political economy, and I try to bring some institutional economics as well. So this is like my own past, I would say. But
Probably because it doesn't give the answer, it's probably the reason why it still remains within a small group of people who follows it. Potentially the attraction of the mainstream economic framework is that it's one tool which gives very concrete answers. It can be completely wrong, but as long as everybody accepts it and you can publish it, that works. I'm a bit puzzled in a way why there are alternative economic theories like post-Keynesian or the ecological economics, why they don't gain the ground. Okay, now a little bit more, but still it's peanuts relatively to the mainstream. Like we essentially economists, we have kind of one path how we view we do the things. Well, okay, maybe I'm a bit biased coming from the central bank, and I can imagine maybe somewhere in the academia there is a more variety of the views, but at least that's how it looks like.
Yeah, there are probably a mix of reasons, but overall, I agree that like they have much less visibility, not only within central banks, in the academia as well, and in what is considered, for instance, top journals in economics. You don't really have these kind of publications, so on. But I would say that probably one of the reasons is probably one we discussed before about what is the role of economists, and these economists they tend to question more the status quo, the existing structure, the existing social relation than what mainstream economics theories and models would do. So there's probably something where it is less accepted as well. There's more rebuttal of these approaches. Because of that, there's also less financial resources for these approaches. And like for instance, when I started my PhD almost 10 years ago now, my idea was to merge a little bit ecological economics with post-Keynesian economics, and it was like very almost not done at all. There were like, I don't know, between 5 and 10 people who had been, or perhaps between 10 and 20 people who had been working on that at the time. So it was something completely new. Today it's gaining momentum and so on. But clearly there's a lack of resources where ecological economics is a small community, post-Keynesian community economics it was a small community. So as a result of of a field that is perhaps more critical, they have probably less resources. And then it's true that there's also probably in a world where we somehow give a lot of emphasis to clear cut results. It's true that that the so-called mainstream economics is a very coherent field with assumptions, epistemological foundations, methodologies that are extremely problematic. We've been discussing that today, but still it is fully coherent. And to some extent, you can come up with like one number. Whereas if you take, let's say, ecological economics, there are debates within ecological economics about what it is and so on. But for instance, someone called Clive Spash, one of the big epistemological thinkers of ecological economics, he says that at the core of that, you have questions such as incomparability and incommensurability of values. So basically, it means that 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 when you want to say how what is the importance of a tree and of a frog, you cannot measure them with the same measure. You cannot say, okay, it's $2 and $1. That this is not how things work. Whereas in mainstream economics, well, it is 2 and 1. you can get to this result. And on top of that, it is incomparable, meaning that you cannot say, okay, it's different measures. One will be in in tons, and the other one in a unit of genetic diversity. But in the end, tons are more important than genetics. No, it's incomparable as well. You cannot say this is better than the other. So of course, when you get into this kind of debates, which are I think fundamental if we want to understand the nature of our ecological crisis. But it's true that someone who would come to you to say, I don't know what you mean, but here I have a result, it's 42. Well, it gives the impression of being more empirical and applied and concrete. I think it's not, but I get your point that it seems more realistic.
And the other point that I took from what you said is that this more alternative view requires from an economist to have a toolbox and use different theories for different questions. While for the mainstream, you learned it once during your master, PhD, and then you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And here there's this famous sentence by Keynes saying that I mean I don't know the exact word, but basically he says that in his mind a good economist is someone who should be a good mathematician, but also a good philosopher, a good statesman, a good historian. I don't know if he brings other skills, but basically he says exactly what you say, that this is what a good economist is someone with like a crazy amount of skills, with like a toolkit that is much broader than just like a set, set of skills that that is like set in stone, and you're like, okay, if you know this, you're economist, period. So Yes, absolutely agree that it is more challenging as well to be, I would say, an economist concerned about socio ecological transition, about power issue, and so on, than being a mainstream economist.
And now I would add to this toolbox also the specialists in the IT, in programming, in climate change, in biodiversity.
Yes, yes. I don't think we can blame Keynes in that case for not having brought it up, but I agree that the toolbox should become even bigger. And it's yeah, there is certainly a trade-off between specialization versus versus having a broad understanding of things. But at the individual level, there's this trade-off. However, if all economics was taught with a more open approach, um, it would be perfectly possible to have a common knowledge that everyone has, and from there people can specialize into something that is more mathematical, something that is more historical, something that is more about natural science, IT, whatever it is, but still coming from a different background than saying like, okay, this is supply and demand period. so it would not be impossible to make progress despite this broad toolkit needed.
If we think about students who are learning the economics or young economists who would like to work on the in the field of the economics, so also on the climate change, so what would be your suggestion? Where to start? What is the must?
Yeah, it depends, because if it's for their career, I have these exchanges quite often with young economists where it's a bit difficult for me to tell them like, yeah, go for this specific approach and so on, because I know things could be more difficult for them too. So I think we need to be also responsible for that, saying like, okay, it's fine. And I know many students would tell me that they would love to have a different training, to specialize on different things, but they also want to be successful researchers, recognized, and so on. So they go for an easier path, and I cannot criticize them. But it's really a pity. So with this important caveat, I would say that someone says, no matter what, I want to have like a complete training. I cannot think today of one specific place where we say, okay, go there and so on. But for instance, there is this master's program, for instance, called EPOG, which is a master that was created a few years ago among many different universities, mostly in Europe, but not only. They have one university in South Africa that is part of the consortium. And basically, this is a place where you would have some ecological economics, some post-Keynesian economics, political economy. There is a little bit of Sraffian economics and so on. So basically, it's really a broad training. In France too, I know that there are a few masters that have been created over the past few years that are called, I think, institutional economics, and like they try to mix up quantitative and qualitative approaches and so on. So there are different avenues that exist out there, but they're still a minority, unfortunately. But I think it's changing. We see that also like a little bit in our schools, such as in the case of France, like the Polytechnique, Sciences Po, which are very well-known schools in France, where like now they have mandatory courses, or they're going to have mandatory courses on environmental issues and so on. So hopefully the direction will change a little bit. But today, unfortunately, it's a difficult personal path, because there's not like a program waiting for you that's going to teach you everything you need.
And I think the question is what exactly you teach, right? So you can also teach these integrated assessment models. So this very classical models with a bunch of climate-related variables, which don't make any change to the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. There's not only what you teach, but how you teach, and that's something that there was a paper, I think, by Nick Stern, and I can't remember who else, like a few years ago, saying that like they had analyzed how much economic journals were covering climate related issues, and they showed like, oh, there are very few publications related to climate in economics and so on. And I think that there was another issue that was not discussed in this paper, was like, but what are the papers that discuss climate change? What are they talking about? Like one extreme example of that is a paper in the American Economic Review, so the AER, the top three, top five depend of economic journals, where the authors look at like what would happen to GDP in case of the so-called jet stream, but basically in terms of a change in thermohaline circulation in the world, and basically like what would be the impact for Europe of basically a crazy tipping point happening in the climate and Earth system. And like given that winters because of that would be cooler in Europe for them, given the methodology they use, like okay, warmer equals worse, but cooler is good. So basically, you have a crazy tipping point happening, and they say that like that global GDP is going to be improved by that, or like or no change at all, which is for me it's even worse than not publishing anything. Having that in the AER, it's unfortunately a very very bad signal that is sent because you're just using methodology, not caring at all about how you do it. So the same goes for training. It's not only about talking about the issue, but how do you talk about the issue.
So are there any books that you would recommend to start with?
Probably quite a lot, but if I try to to recommend a few books that cover the broad range of issues we discussed, I would say perhaps like starting a bit far from economics. I really like someone, a sociologist called Norbert Elias, who has like especially one book called The Society of Individuals, because it really talks about this question of individualism versus holistic views. Like how to make sure we don't fall into a purely individualist view of the world or into a view of the world where humans have no agency. Like how to work with that. And I think it's for me a very important book. I also like talking about anthropology. So, for instance, David Graeber's book on debt, called "Debt: The First 5,000 Years." I think this is a very important book. And then perhaps coming a bit closer to some of the things we've been discussing. For ecological economics, there's a recent book by Clive Spash, which is a bit controversial, I think, sometimes, but it's called, I think, Foundation for Social and Ecological Economics. So very good introduction to ecological economics. I mentioned earlier Ha-Joon Chang about trade. So he wrote this book, Kicking Away the Ladder, which I think is a very interesting critical perspective on like the reason of why some countries got richer than others. Yeah, that's probably quite already covering quite a broad range of books that were quite important for me. Maybe I would also say, talking about post-Keynesian economics, there's a lot there, but I would say that in my case, I was quite influenced by Hyman Minsky, a great thinker of financial instability. He has a book called "Can It Happen Again?" And for French speakers, there's a very good summary of his ideas by a book written by Laurence Sialom. But yeah, for English speakers, I guess they would have to go to the original.
How optimistic are you regarding the human capacity to solve this challenge? And if you're optimistic, so what keeps you optimistic?
I'm not necessarily very optimistic. I wouldn't say that like I'm depressed and but I would say that it's an easy way out. I would say to your question, but I would say quoting an author that I have barely read, so I'm a bit ashamed, but still, Gramsci. Like there's this famous quote, which is a pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. So I would say that this would qualify a little bit how I try to go forward.
Thank you very much, Romain. We have covered really many things. Well, we haven't been able to cover everything, and still it took us quite a while. So maybe the rest we will leave for another time. But thank you very much again. That was super interesting.
Thank you so much.